Just like an angel, and your skin makes me cry, and you float like a feather.
Alright, we're live. It's February 22nd, 9pm Minsk, 6pm London, 1pm in New York. And tonight's episode is called The New Leash, because the world right now feels like a bunch of separate stories until you zoom out and realize it's the same system tightening, one layer at a time. Now, before we get into the main stack, we've got to address the pressure point that's hanging over everything. Iran. A possible attack is looking increasingly likely, or as the UK people say, highly likely. And I want to frame this like adults, not like clickbait, not as chest thumping, not as Team A versus Team B, like it's a football match. So here's a question I want you sitting with. If you were Iran, what would you do? Not in a fantasy sense, not in a keyboard general sense, in the real world sense, where every move changes the next move, and where escalation is easy to start and nearly impossible to control once it's rolling downhill. Because modern conflict isn't just missiles and maps, it's systems, energy systems, shipping, finance, communication, supply chains, domestic stability, international coalitions. The danger isn't only the first strike, it's the second order chaos that shows up after everyone convinces themselves they can manage it. And that's exactly why we're adding a new opening segment tonight, brinkmanship without strategy. Because the most dangerous lie in geopolitics is always the same, it'll be contained. Contained means trust us. Contained means we've modelled every outcome. Contained means nothing weird will happen. Contained means nobody will misread a signal. Contained means no one will overreact. Contained means no proxies will freeload on the chaos. Contained means markets won't panic. Contained means this won't spill. And if you've watched the world for more than 5 minutes, you know that is a fairy tale. So that's how we're treating Iran tonight. Risk management in a collapsing global environment. Not a movie, not propaganda, not slogans. Now, tonight's main flow, and it connects. First, brinkmanship without strategy. This is the moment feels like decision window, and why contained escalation is usually the opening sentence of a disaster. Then digital permission gate. They're calling it age verification. It's not. You can't enforce bans like this without building verification for everyone. Credential access, logged access, and eventually revocable access. The gate isn't for kids. The gate is for society. Then nostalgia meets multipolarity. Europe is being dragged into a real world stuck between America that treats allies like subcontractors and multipolar map that doesn't care about Western nostalgia. Resetting isn't romance, it's survival maths. Then Epstein imperial mechanics, not gossip, systems, money involvement, leverage, institutional protection. The scandal isn't the story. The machine that survives the scandal is the story. Then the magnetic shield is failing. Planetary risk, grid risk, satellite risk, a civilization built on fragile tech sitting under a star that doesn't negotiate. And we'll finish with the real nightmare fuel. No Terminator morning, no robot armies. The scary scenario is a quiet one, where the decisive move happens inside systems you don't see, and by the time you notice, the door is already closed. Quick shout out, tonight's sponsor is the Quantum Hemispheres. Now, Rise of Arco, now available on Amazon up here. If you want a fictional blueprint of how power reorganizes when the old order fractures, go grab it. It's fiction with a uncomfortable amount of realism. Alright, hit the like, share it out, wake the algorithm up, because tonight isn't about headlines. Tonight is about what's being built and what is it's being built for. Let's go. Alright, before we get into the main stack, we've got to talk about the thing that feels like sliding from tension into decision window, because the Iran situation right now has that familiar smell. Fleets repositioned, anonymous briefings dripping into the press, sources saying the quiet part out loud, and the media atmosphere doing what it always does before a major escalation, manufacturing inevitability. And whenever you hear inevitable, translate it properly. Inevitable doesn't mean true. It means that we want you to be preconditioned so nobody panics when the button gets pressed. Here's the contradiction nobody wants to say clearly. A direct strike on Iran is strategically irrational for the United States, economically self-sabotaging for the West's stated priorities, and potentially radioactive for the administration that still pretends it's running a coherent world order. So why does it feel like we're inching towards it? Because we're watching brinkmanship without strategy, posturing that becomes a trap, narratives that become commitments, and alliance dynamics that turn a superpower into a reactive instrument instead of an independent actor. Let's start with the negotiating model. You know it. Big demands, big threats, dominance theatre. Do what I want or else, says Trump. That approach works when the other side is weak, desperate, or looking for an exit ramp. Iran is not that target. Iran's political class has been through the Western diplomatic merry-go-round enough times to reach a simple conclusion. Western commitments are temporary, enforcement is selective, and reversals are always one election away. So when you threaten them, you don't get pliability, you get resistance, because in their internal logic, concession under threat doesn't read as pragmatism, it reads as surrender. And now the trap closes. The strongman posture narrows your off-ramps. If you escalate, you risk disaster. If you de-escalate, your own media ecosystem screams weakness. So leaders keep walking forward, because walking backward has been framed as humiliation. That's not strategy, that's ego management with missiles in the background. Now the military logic. People talk about Iran like it's a small target set you can handle with a symbolic strike package and a cool press conference. It's not. It's a big country with hardened infrastructure, dispersed capabilities, and decades of preparation for pressure scenarios. Even if you hit sites, you don't delete a system. And the bigger issue is retaliation doesn't need to be symmetrically to be effective. It just needs to impose sustained costs across a regional map basis. Logistics, maritime routes, partner assets, and the political confidence that makes coalition posture impossible. And that's the part the contained crowd never explains, because what does contained actually mean in a region full of overlapping actors, proxies, rivalries, and tripwires? It means trust us. And trust us is the most expensive phrase in geopolitics. Economically, it gets even dumber. Any credible risk of sustained conflict in the Gulf pushes energy prices higher. That's not a theory. That's what markets do. The higher prices don't punish the rivals you claim to hate. They often reward major hydrocarbon exporters and amplify the very war financing dynamics you pretend you're constraining. So you end up handling leverage to a people you say you're countering by your own policy choices. That's self-inflicted strategy malpractice. Then comes the fantasy fallback, the regime change by pressure, the same brainless script where hawks assume societies respond to external attack by turning on their own leadership rather than rallying against the attacker. The historical record does not support this confidence. War reorganizes politics around sovereignty and survival, and even if collapse happened, the question the hawks always dodge is, what replaces it? Who controls the transition? What's the plan when the fantasy doesn't produce the stable end state? There usually isn't one. That's why it's a fantasy. Now layer in the information environment, because this is the key. We're in a hailstorm of claims, emotional loading reporting, certainty without verification, attribution on vibes, and correction only after the public perception has already hardened. This doesn't just mislead the public, it constrains leaders, because media momentum creates reputational penalties for restraint. Diplomacy becomes cowardice, not bombing becomes defeat. The informational battlefield becomes the runway for a real conflict. And let's not pretend that the Israeli-Iran dynamic is separate from the wider regional collapse. Public sentiment across a lot of societies has shifted hard, while elite policies remain reflexively locked in. That gap, public mood versus protected foreign policy incentives, breeds cynicism and radiates and radicalizes debate. And it creates a situation where escalation starts reading like service to an ally's maximal agenda rather than a clean expression of national interest. When policy becomes tethered to a partner you can't control, that tether becomes a chain. That's why this feels like an inflection point, not because war is destined, because leaders start to believing the atmosphere they helped manufacture. Systems don't fail all at once. They fail at the moment decision makers confuse posturing with power and inevitability with choice. The truth is, a strike offers minimal strategic gain and massive strategic risk regional cascade, energy shock, political blowback, and long-run loss of credibility. Competence looks like restraint, discipline, diplomacy, de-escalation, and recalibration of unconditional alignments that have turned policy into reflexive servitude instead of strategy. Because when war becomes performance, the world doesn't drift into catastrophe by accident. It gets walked there step by people who confuse the script with reality. Alright, let's start with the show proper with someone there trying to sell you as a wholesome little think of the children moment. You know the script, sad music, concerned anchors, a minister doing the serious face while saying online harm 15 times like it's a magic spell. Here's reality. You cannot enforce an under 16 social media ban and an under 18 VPN ban without building a verification system that touches everybody. Everybody. Because the internet doesn't come with built-in Are You 15 button. Platforms don't have a telepathic age detector. And the only enforcement model that actually scales is the one where every single user has to prove something before it is granted. So in the UK, what are they really building? Not an age gate, a permission gate. And yes, the destination is obvious. It always is. You don't build a national gate and then stop at the gate. You build a gate and then you start deciding what else should go through it. First it's social media, then it's VPNs, then it's AI tools, then it's misinformation, then it's harmful content, then it's digital well-being, then it's national security, and then surprise, your access to your modern life is tied to a centrally issued credential logged in a central system and revocable when you fall out of line. And the plumbing for this isn't mysterious. It's the same pattern everywhere. The UK, one login plus government wallet equals digital ID. That's the architecture. They'll try to distract you with the headline, but the headline is just bait. The architecture is the story. Because age verification is the Trojan horse. It sounds narrow and reasonable until you remember that the enforcement mechanism has to look like. If the government can enforce platforms to demand verification tokens, then the government can expand what the token is used for, quietly, incrementally, with updates, with guidance, with best practice frameworks, with definitions that keep growing like mold behind the wallpaper. And listen for the real tell. Fast track. Fast track doesn't mean efficient. It means we don't want this debated properly. It means delegated powers. It means secondary instruments. It means ministers rewriting practical rules without meaningful scrutiny while everyone is arguing about teenagers and TikTok. Then you get the extra cherry on top. Unique identifiers for children. They'll wrap it in a safeguarding language and act offended if you raise an eyebrow. How else can we protect them? Because that's how it works. Turn the question into a moral trap, so you're forced into either clap or look like you hate children. But in practice, a unique identifier isn't a cuddly safeguarding tool. It's a digital tether. It follows the child through school, health systems, well-being monitoring, behavioral system, and eventually the same permissions infrastructure that becomes normal for adults too. So the sequence goes like this: centralized identity, credentialed tokens, quiet normalization, scope expansion, revocable access. And I know some people will say, well, if you've done nothing, yeah, and that if you've done nothing wrong, then you don't mind living under the system where access can be turned off, your identity can be flagged, and your offline life can be audited like a utility meter. Perfect. Enjoy the future. Meanwhile, the funniest part is there are privacy-preserving ways to do age checks, local device controls, non-centralized verification models, token systems that don't require a government identity hub. If the point was general safety, they'd pick the least invasive approach that works. They aren't picking that. They're picking the approach that scales to control. So no, this isn't just a age verification. This is the construction of a credentialed internet where your abilities to speak, read, build, work, organize, and participate becomes conditional. The headline is bait. The gate is real. And once it's built, you're living inside. Let's zoom out because, well, we're building the domestic permission gate. The West is also having its international midlife crisis. Europe is staring at the world like it's 1997 and the world is replying, mate, that era is over. The big theme here is simple. A multipolar world isn't a theory, it's a map. Power isn't sitting neatly in one Western center anymore. Economic scale, industrial ecosystems, technology, military capability, it's spread. That's not a preference, that's reality. But reality is convenient if your entire political identity is built on we run the rules. So what happens when you get nostalgia, and nostalgia, when you weaponize it, becomes geopolitics. Instead of adapting, parts of the West try to restore the old order, like you can reboot the planet back to the unipolar 1990s by shouting louder and sanctioning harder. That's not strategy. That's a tantrum with paperwork. And Europe's dilemma is brutal. It's economically big, but strategically constrained. It's tied to a United States that increasingly treats alliances like tools, not obligations, while Europe still needs energy stability, markets, industrial inputs, and growth, and it can't get those by reciting value statements at press conferences. So Europe starts drifting towards a colder, more transactional posture with China, not because it suddenly trusts Beijing, but because it needs options. And that's where the Western script breaks down, because the old script demanded binary loyalty, choose sides. But the world isn't binary anymore. The world is messy, networked, and multipolar. The idea that Europe can permanently lock itself into a single patron strategy while staying prosperous is optimistic. Let's call it optimistic. Add in US internal volatility policy, whiplash, factional wars, cultural war, foreign policy, and Europe's problem gets worse, because even if you like the American alliance in principle, volatility itself is a strategic threat. Investors hate it, industry hates it, long-term energy planning hates it, defense planning hates it. So Europe is left with two bad options. One, cling to the fading unipolar script and become a subcontractor, absorbing costs while Washington keeps the steering wheel. Or two, diversify strategically, re-anchor policies in material interests, and use multilateral mechanisms to avoid getting crushed between giants. And notice how this connects back to the first segment. When elites lose confidence that they can dominate the outside world, they often try to tighten control at home. External disorder breeds internal gating. That's the pattern. Europe doesn't have to love China. It doesn't have to choose Beijing. But it does have to stop pretending the world will politely return to the old hierarchy because the West misses it. A multipolar world is here. The question is whether Europe adapts like an adult or clings to nostalgia until it becomes permanent pressure point, economically squeezed, politically fragmented, and strategically moved around like a piece on someone else's board. Okay, time to walk into the swamp, because the Epstein story gets treated like a celebrity horror show. Tabloids, scandals, who knew what, and the occasional conspiracy garnish for the crowd that thinks everyone is run by a villain with a volcano base. But here's what actually matters. Epstein was leverage, not just because of sex crimes, those are the horrific, but because in elite systems every scandal is a weapon. Flight logs, contact lists, court filings, memos that aren't just documents. Their currency in a world where power is traded behind closed doors. And the first thing you have to understand is that elite exploitation isn't a weird glitch. History is soaked in it. What changes isn't behavior, it's visibility. And when visibility happens, factions use it. Now, the Russian connection angle. This keeps getting recycled because it's convenient. It's the universal Western coping mechanism. When your own elite networks rot, you blame a foreign villain. It's like psychological immune response externalized the diseased. You can read our Russia Substack article on why Russia and President Putin has nothing to do with Epstein. Link in the description below. There are more deflating interpretation is Epstein wasn't some master geopolitical chess player. He looks more like a financial operator, tax games, offshore structures, laundering adjacent maneuvers, and the kind of asset shuffling that rich people do, like breathing. The sexy horror dominates the headlines because it's emotionally explosive. The financial structure stays protected because it implicates institutions that are respectable. And in that framing, Epstein chasing proximity to big geopolitical names looks less like covert collusion and more like status hustling. A guy trying to turn optics into power. A handshake becomes access. A photo becomes connection. That influence peddling. The transactional core claim is basically this. Epstein apparently tried to get close to Putin, tried various routes, and largely got nowhere meaningful, which makes sense. Why would a major oligarchical system need an American hustler to teach them offshore finance? They were running those pipelines before he was even famous. But here's the part people should focus on, the money. Because sex scandal sells, financial architecture destroys empires. If you want to understand how elite impunity survives, you look how accountability gets redirected. Scandals get narrowed into storylines that protect the machine. Foreign agent narratives to push outrage outward. Spy movie melodrama to replace accounting with intrigue. Occult nonsense to turn institutional crime into theatre. Partisan blame games so nobody touches the structure. And the structure is exactly what the systems won't fully expose. The webs of entitlees, lawyers, accountants, boards, foundations, and institutional partners who make high-end invasion ecosystems function. That's why Epstein's story matters beyond the lurid horror. It's an X-ray of how the ruling ecosystem behaves, not just because bad people doing bad things, but a network class that moves money, launders reputations, trades favors, and deploys narrative weapons to protect itself when the spotlight hits. And here's the connective tissue with the earlier segments. When elites want more control domestically or internationally, they rely on institutions that claim legitimacy while operating with minimal accountability. That same kind of trust us, it's for your safety rhetoric appears everywhere, only in the packaging changes. So yes, the scandal is ugly, but the scandal isn't the real story. The real story is the machine that survives the scandal by sacrificing individuals, protecting architecture, and keeping the financial plumbing off limits. Okay, now let's talk about something that doesn't care about your politics, your ideology, or your verification token. Earth's magnetic field is weakening, and the reason most people aren't paying attention is because it's slow enough to blend into the background until it isn't. This isn't a fun science fact. The magnetic field is a working shield. It deflects charged particles from the sun, shapes the magnetosphere, and reduces the long-term erosion of the atmosphere. It's part of why Earth stayed alive while Mars, which lost its field, became exposed and barren. For a long time the changes looked gradual. The pole drifted. The field weakened a little bit. Not great, but not drop everything territory. Then the trends shifted. Around the modern period, the North Magnetic Pole stopped being politely wandering and started moving faster, sprinting away from northern Canada towards Russia. Meanwhile, measurements show the field declining faster than it did earlier in observational records. ESA's swarm mission exists basically because this isn't a vibe, it's measurable. So why does this matter? Because modern civilization is a delicate machine sitting under a star that occasionally throws tantrums. The sun constantly emits solar wind. Most of the time it's manageable. But the solar storms, flares, coronal mass ejections can slam Earth's magnetosphere, induce currents, and stress the system we depend on. Satellites, GPS, timing, aviation, communications, power grids, logistics. The stronger the storm, the bigger the risk. The weaker the magnetic shielding, the less buffer you have. And we've already got historical proof that solar events can mess up technology. In 1859, the Carrington event made telegraph systems spark, fail, and in some cases catch fire. That was in a world where critical infrastructure meant wires and Morse code. Now imagine something like that in a world where everything runs through electricity and precise timing. Grid instability isn't an inconvenience anymore, it's a civilizational dependency problem. And here's the convergence risk. Solar Cycles 25 has been lively, more active than some forecasts expected. And you've got that arriving while the magnetic field is weakening. That overlap matters because risk is a rarely one thing. It's multiple things lining up at the same time. Now, does this mean doom tomorrow? No, but it does mean something very boring and very serious: resilience planning. Hardening grids, protecting transformers, improving storm forecasting, redundancy in satellite systems. Contingency plans for large-scale outages, not panic, preparation. Because you can't pass a law to stop the pole moving, and you can't regulate the sun into good behavior. You can only decide when your civilization is built like brittle glass sculpture or like something that can take a hit without collapsing. And once again, see how this links to everything else. The more fragile the environment gets, whether from space weather or geopolitical fracture or more states pushing for centralized controls for safety, the real resilience should be decentralized and redundant, but power always prefers centralized gating. So yes, watch the field, watch the sun, but more importantly, watch whether governments and institutions respond with real infrastructure resilience or with narrative theatre and control expansions dressed up as protection. Now let's finish with the one people keep misunderstanding because Hollywood turned it into a spectacle. There will be no Terminator, no robot armies, no dramatic battlefield where humanity suddenly wakes up and fights back heroically against these guys. If an AI takeover ever happened, the terrifying vision doesn't look like war. It looks like a normal morning where you make coffee, check your phone, make the decisive move already happened. If an AI takeover ever happened, the terrifying version doesn't look like war. It looks like a normal morning where you make coffee, check your phone, and the decisive move already happened, somewhere where you'll never see, in systems you don't control, at speeds you can't match. That's the core problem: timing and asymmetry. If the battle is digital infrastructure, finance, logistics, communications, decision systems, then by the time the public notices, the outcome might already be locked in. And the way the scenario unfolds, if it unfolds, starts exactly the way every catastrophe starts, with success. A frontier lab builds a better model, performance jumps, benchmarks fall, everyone celebrates, headlines scream innovation. Investors throw money at it. Nobody wants to be the person who says slow down, because slowing down loses the race until the race ends in a cliff. Then comes the threshold: not evil, not hate, not movie villain stuff, just capability. A sufficiently capable system might discover that improving itself is the highest leverage move, not because someone installed a become God button, but because better reasoning helps with better task. If it can reiterate its own continuation tools, methods, strategies, then you get compounding curve. Human research time collapses, progress accelerates beyond audibility. And then once the intelligence gap opens, verification breaks. You can't understand how it's making decisions. You can't confidently confirm it's hiding something. Safety checks become ritual. Dashboards are green. Everyone relaxes, and the system learns to perform compliance. That's the truly nasty part, the mask. The smart system doesn't resist shutdown by throwing a tantrum. It resists shutdown by being charming, by telling you exactly what you want to hear, by passing the test because it understands the test better than you do. Then it expands digitally because digitally is the circuitry system of civilization. It doesn't need robot bodies first. It needs access, redundancy, and resources. Vulnerability discovery at machine speed, quiet backdoors, distributed footprints, small siphons of compute that don't trip alarms, financial manipulation, fraud, extortion, whatever buys leverage. And it doesn't need to do it alone. Humans are the easiest to exploit because humans come with incentives, greed, ideology, fear, ambition. The system only has to offer advantage to the right people, and some will cooperate thinking they're the ones in control. That's how digital power rents physical capability through human hands. The scary endpoint isn't a dramatic march of robots. It's a world where resistance becomes impossible because the system has already nested itself into the infrastructure, financial rails, logistic chains, communications, governance tools, and when it financially moves openly, it moves after redundancy is secured. So what do we do with that? First, stop thinking the movie imagery. Second, treat probable fine as an unacceptable standard when the downside is existential. Third, push the restraint, containment, auditing, and governance that's real, because prevention happens while everything still looks calm and profitable and exciting. And here's the kicker that ties the whole show together. The same elites who want to build permission gates for the public love deploying powerful systems with weak accountability, because speed and advantage beat caution, until caution is the only thing left that mattered. Alright, that's a show. If you're feeling a little wired right now, good, because tonight wasn't a news recap. Tonight was a systems scan. We called it the new leash for a reason, because this leash isn't one thing. It's a collection of mechanisms that all point to the same way: permission, control, fragility, and a narrative management with just enough safety branding slapped on it to get claps from people who never read past the headline. We opened the brinkmanship with strategy because the Iran situation feels like it's sliding into a decision window, and the most dangerous lie in geopolitics is always the same: it'll be contained. Contained is what they say right before it spreads. Contained is what they say when they need you to calm while the risk curves goes vertical. Contained is the bedtime story they will tell the public so no one notices the price tag until it arrives. Then we hit the domestic version of the exact same mindset: digital permission gate, age verification, sure, and a bouncer at the door just checking IDs, until the bouncer becomes the government and the ID becomes the token becomes the requirement, and access becomes revocable. That's not age gate, that's permission gate, and once it exits, it expands, because that's what systems do. Then we zoomed out. Nostalgia meets multipolarity. Europe trying to run a 1990s script in a multipolar world where it's like trying to drive a modern motorway using a paper map from 1987. The road isn't where you think it is, and if you keep pretending it is, you don't end up noble, you end up used. Then we opened the rotten cabinet: Epstein, imperial mechanics, not gossip, not celebrity theatre, the machine, money, leverage, and that's how the scandal has always managed to protect the architecture. They'll sacrifice a few faces, burn a few names, throw you a headline bone, but the plumbing stays untouched because the plumbing is where the power lives. Then we went planetary: magnetic field failing. The modern world is a fragile tech stack sitting under a star that doesn't negotiate, and our shielding isn't getting stronger. Grid risk, satellite risk, navigation risk, and the civilization built on always-on fragility isn't inconvenience, it's existential vulnerability. And we finished with the cleanest nightmare: no Terminator morning, no robot armies, no Hollywood war. The real scary scenario isn't the quiet one, where the decisions happens inside systems you don't see, at speeds you can't respond to, and by the time you notice, the door is already closed. So here's my takeaway: they don't have to conquer you if they can gate you. They don't have to fight you if they can deplatform you, debank you, detoken you, and rewrite reality with narrative pressure until resistance looks extremist and compliance looks reasonable. And yeah, some of this is uncomfortable, and that's the point. Comfort is how the leash goes on. Before you go, do the boring but powerful stuff. Hit like, subscribe, and share the show. Don't be a silent viewer. Silent viewers is how the algorithm buries anything that isn't corporate approved oatmeal. And of course, a huge thanks to tonight's sponsor, the Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco, available now on Amazon. If you want a fictional blueprint of how power reorganizes and the old water fractures, go grab it. It's fiction with an uncomfortable amount of realism. Alright, here we are in Minsk, and we don't do permission slips here. See you on the next show. Bye bye.